Today we're going to be talking about consequentialism, or really consequentialisms. We're going to be talking about a variety of moral theories that are very closely related to one another, but nevertheless differ in a few ways, differ in what they take as their basic units of analysis. All nevertheless count as versions of consequentialism. To set the stage here, I think it will be helpful for me to sketch out a little picture of what goes on in moral decision-making and deliberation. Suppose I am trying to make a decision. So there's me. And I'm thinking about what to do about a situation, so I'm contemplating. And as I contemplate, what am I really doing? What is going on in the process of my decision-making? Any ethical theory, a theory about what kind of person to be and what to do and how to decide, has to think about what is a model here for what goes on in the process of deliberation. What does it mean to make a decision? Well, one of the things that I do, surely, is identify a range of options from which I have to choose. So if I'm thinking, what's going on in my head, part of it is there is this range of options that I identify. And then I have to decide what I'm going to do about that range of options. I do that in relation to some goal I have. And so there is some kind of goal I have in mind, and I want this action to be one that leads to the goal. So I'm going to try to find a way of selecting among these options. Now, what am I going to do? Well, in the process of thinking about this, I'm going to presumably think, okay, if I have that goal, then what exactly do I want to accomplish here? What are the parts of this? How do I attain that goal? So I'm going to be directing means toward an end, but in the process of doing that, I am going to be thinking in terms of, well, my motivations. Okay, maybe I want this and care about that, but I also have this other goal. I want that and I want this one. And so there might be multiple goals here that I have in mind. And in addition to that, you might say there might be multiple motives that I have in relation to those goals. Out of those, I make some selection. So I enter into a process thinking about the options and my motives and my goals of making a decision. And out of that decision, I form an intention to act in a certain way, and then I actually act in that way. Well, my action then has a variety of effects. And so it has certain consequences. Certain things result from my action. And then I can compare those consequences to the goals that I had and see how well I did. Now, of course, there are various things that shape this in the background. So, for example, yes, I'm thinking about these motives and goals in relation to my range of options. And so one of the things that delimits all of this and affects it is just the conditions in the world. I may have many options or very few options. But of course, part of it is, in addition to just the world shaping this, my own character shapes this. And in addition to my own character, that leads me to consider certain options and rank them in certain ways, evaluate them in certain ways, have certain goals and so forth. There are also other things, so a variety of additional factors, including the various social institutions that I'm a part of, and then ultimately, I suppose, the entire civilization that I'm part of. All of those things are going to be shaping the way I think about these problems. Now, the reason I talk about this is that with respect to a consequentialist moral theory, or for that matter, any moral theory, we have to make two kinds of decisions. One, we have to decide what is our basic unit of analysis? Where are we going to think about where to make the, you might say, fundamental evaluation of what's better than what, of what's a good action, what's a bad action, what I ought to do. I'm going to think in terms of what exactly? Well, the consequentialist says, I'm going to think in terms of consequences. And so one way to think about consequentialism is to say, I'm going to focus primarily on this and characterize what it is to be a good consequence or a bad consequence. And then I will try to understand all the rest of this in terms of acting in such a way that I produce good consequences. You could do things very differently. For example, you could be Aristotle and focus on virtue And then you might say, I'm going to focus on character at the other end of this and think hard about it and take it as my basic unit. I'm going to think the primary question is what kind of person I should be. And then when I make a decision, I'm going to think, what would a person like that do? Of course, there are other options. I might look at the method of decision itself, and in another lecture soon coming up, we'll be talking about that. But the consequentialist says, well, however exactly we arrange this, this is really what we're aiming at. This is our ultimate measure of success, of what it is to act well, to act badly, to be a good person, bad person, and so on. We test it by consequences, hence the name consequentialism. The other thing I have to decide is, well, what do I want to relate to that most directly? Is it action? Is it something else? And indeed, the versions of consequentialism we're going to talk about today vary with respect to that. They say, I care primarily about consequences, but consequences of what? The most obvious thing to say is action. And so most often one encounters versions of consequentialism that are act consequentialist. They say, I'm going to look primarily at the consequences of actions. But you could also say, I'm going to focus primarily on the consequences of having certain motives or goals, on the consequences of having a certain character, on the consequences of being part of a certain institution, or the consequences of a civilization, and so on. So there are various places in here you could say, I care mostly about the consequences of this, and then I try to understand all the rest in those terms. So let's take a look at how the basic approach of consequentialism works out as we try to develop a theory. Consequentialism is, as I understand it, primarily a theory about what is better than what. It is not primarily a theory that tries to draw a line between good actions and bad actions, the end, or to tell you exactly what your obligations are and what is prohibited. It is not mostly a theory about thou shalts and thou shalt nots. Here is, I take it, the fundamental idea behind consequentialism. X, whatever X is, whether it's an action or a rule for action or a motive or a character trait or an entire civilization, X is more preferable to Y if X tends to lead to better consequences than Y does. We're going to talk later about all the dimensions of this idea of starting with what makes something better than. Here I've said X is morally preferable, but you could just say is better than. That would be simpler. I don't know why I didn't do that. X is better than Y, right? It's a better thing if it leads to better consequences. That's the entire idea. So if we apply that to acts, we're going to be thinking one act is better than another if it has better consequences. If we think about rules for action, we're going to say that rule is better if it leads to better consequences. We think about a motive, that motive is better if it leads to better consequences. We think about a method of decision. That decision method is better if it leads to better consequences. A character trait. This one's better than that one if it leads to better consequences. Is it really true that pride is better than humility, or that humility is better than pride? Which one has better consequences? And then we can ask the same thing about institutions, about entire civilizations, about all sorts of things. So there can be many versions of this thought. But nevertheless, the basic idea is this thing is better than that thing if it has better consequences. End of story. Well, in a way, that's simple enough. Notice this is something that says the moral value derives entirely from the consequences. Everything else is built on top of consequences. And that's what gives it the name, consequentialism. We could take that as a definition of consequentialism, the view that moral value derives entirely from consequences. Here is one version. It's a version of act consequentialism in Jeremy Bentham, and this is one we're going to look at in great detail later. By the principle of utility, Bentham says, is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what's the same thing, in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. What is this saying? It's saying, my theory approves or disapproves any action whatsoever. Action, notice. So we're talking about actions here. So my theory approves this action to this extent. So we're talking about really putting things on a scale of, the degree of approval. So we're talking about what's better than what. And he's saying this action is better if it appears to have a greater tendency to contribute to happiness. Whose happiness? Well, the happiness of people affected by that action. Sometimes it might just be the actor, the person who's doing it. Nobody else is really affected. Maybe it's a small group of people. Maybe it's a very large group. Maybe it's the entire world. So it depends. Most of us don't have that much impact on that many people. But some people do have tremendous impact on billions of people. So Bentham means it to apply in all these situations. We have to think, well, how does this affect the happiness of those people? Happiness here is the kind of consequence he cares about. But we could understand the nature of consequences and what makes them good and bad in different ways and still be a consequentialist. Here's another version. It's also a version of act consequentialism in John Stuart Mill, who was a student of Jeremy Bentham. In fact, Mill was taught, homeschooled as a child by two people, James Mill, his father, a famous economist, and also Jeremy Bentham. Mill says the creed that accepts the foundation of morals as utility or the greatest happiness principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Again, happiness is the measure. We look at consequences, we say, what do they contribute or detract from happiness? An action is right in proportion to its tendency to promote happiness. And so we say this act is better than this action if it has a greater tendency to promote happiness. Well, we're looking there at actions, and we're focusing on happiness as our measure of the goodness of a consequence. But it's clearly a version of consequentialism. We're looking at the consequences of actions and judging them. So in this form of consequentialism, act consequentialism, we look at the consequences of action and the relationship between an act and its consequences. But that's not the only version of consequentialism that there is. We could also focus on rules for action or policies. That's something that is a generalization, you might say, about how to act. And if we're contemplating rules for action, whether it's an informal social rule or a formal law or regulation, we can think about it in these terms. Now, you might think, well, is this rule one that leads to actions that lead to good consequences? That's still a form of act utilitarianism. Actions and their consequences are primary. But you could also say, I want to focus just on the rule. What are the consequences of adopting this rule? And that gives you a version of rule consequentialism. Maybe the first person to advance a theory like that, although actually I think Maimonides may have had such a version, but the first one to clearly articulate this is Bishop Barclay. In framing the general laws of nature, it's granted we must be entirely guided by the public good of mankind, but not in the ordinary moral actions of our lives. The rule is framed with respect to the good of mankind, but our practice must always be shaped immediately by the rule. In other words, he's saying we think about rules in terms of the consequences. We try to pick out what's the best rule, and then we adapt our actions to that rule. So what should you do? Well, the act consequentialist says, act so that your action promotes the best consequences. Basically, prefer to act in a way that is better with respect to the consequences, usually promoting happiness. Barclay says, actually follow the rule that is the best rule for producing happiness. Now, there's a possible tension here, as we'll see. It could be that there is a rule that's a very good rule, but in this case, it's better to break it. It might be that there are situations where actually I would not want this to be a general rule, but in this case, it seems like the right thing to do. Here is the 20th century's philosopher who revived rule consequentialism, R.F. Herod. He'll find it necessary to refine the crude utilitarian principle by applying the process of generalization in all relevant cases. He here being a philosopher who thinks about these issues and tries to be a consequentialist. Herod is saying it's important to actually think about the general pattern of action, not what promotes the good the best in this situation, but in general, think about the general rule for action, the general policy. Now, why do we have to do that? Well, partly because it is a basic ethical principle that we want to judge similar cases similarly, and so we want to be fair and consistent across the board. But partly also, it's because we have to think about the tendencies of action. And how do I know what the tendency of this particular action is, as performed by me? I don't have any way of knowing that except by thinking about the general rule and saying, well, in general, how does this thing work out? Okay, what are the consequences of following this rule in general? And that's how I determine the tendencies. So Herod's point, and it's actually a much more complicated argument than this, But in a way, the basic idea is, look, we have to apply the same rule to the same cases or to similar cases across the board to be consistent. But in addition to that, we have no way to really judge tendencies in individual cases except by looking at the general rule. Now, as I mentioned, these can diverge. It can turn out that in a certain situation, you can do the better thing or follow the better rule, but you can't do both. Okay? Sometimes those disagree when breaking the better rule could produce better consequences in that particular case. The examples of this, well, some of them are morally dramatic, where it seems as if I follow the general rule and do what's generally thought to be the right thing, I'm going to get us all in a lot of trouble, and the consequences of that will be terrible. But there are also very trivial cases. When I was a child, my father was driving, I think, back to our house from my grandparents' house. It wasn't very far, but you had to go up a hill, and up at the top of the hill was a stoplight. It was snowing that night. And he went up to the top of the hill, and I had been watching a show called Highway Patrol, which was on every early evening. And so I was learning all about traffic rules, and I loved cars as a kid. And so we were approaching the red light, and guess what? My father went through the red light. And I said, Daddy, red means stop. Green means go. And he said, well, look, yeah, you're right, of course. But in this case, if I stop on the hill, it's icy, I'm not going to be able to start up again. And there's nobody around, it's late at night. So I just decided it was best to go through the red light. I said, but red means stop. Well, what should you do in that case? The act utilitarian, or the act consequentialist more generally, is going to say do what has the best consequences. So in this case, yeah, don't get stuck on the hill. There's nobody around. There's no real risk, no real danger. Break the law. Go through the red light. But the rule consequentialist will say, but it's a good rule. But red means stop. Green means go. So in effect, my father was the act consequentialist. I was the rule consequentialist in the back seat, saying, no, you can't break the good rule. Anyway, that's a minor example, but it's the kind of tension that can happen all the time between these two versions of consequentialism. So it's not a trivial thing. And we'll come back to this because Maimonides and John Stuart Mill have a certain view of how you deal with these conflicts.